Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Linda Schenk, and I'm the Executive Officer for Wine Communicators of Australia. I'm a little bit excited today because it's our last webinar for 2019, and I'm super delighted to be sitting here next to Sandy Hathaway, who is an analyst with the Wine Australian Market Insights team. Sandy will be speaking to us about the value of direct-to-consumer wine sales and key benchmarks taken from the 2019 Cellar and direct-to-consumer survey that was conducted by Wine Australia, and how this data can be used to increase the profitability of your cellar doors. We'll be taking questions throughout the presentation, so down the bottom of your screen there should be a little Q&A button. Feel free to click on the Q&A button when you have a question and type it through at any stage. Sandy will be pausing throughout the presentation to be able to answer those questions, so please ask her some so that she doesn't feel silly. As per usual, we will be recording this seminar, or this webinar, I beg your pardon, and the link to the recording will be sent to you at a later stage so you can rewatch it at any time that you like. But that's enough from me. I'm going to slide out of the screen and hand you over to Sandy. Thanks, Sandy.
Thanks, Linda. I'll slide across a bit here. Hello, everyone. And yes, welcome to the last webinar of 2019 for Wine Communicators. We're on a countdown to Christmas now. Isn't that exciting? Okay, and as Linda said, today I'll talk to you about the direct-to-consumer and cellar door survey that we conducted in 2019 and the results of it and what they mean, hopefully, for you and your cellar door. Oh dear. Okay, there we go. So I'll give you a bit of an outline of the survey and mainly spend the time going through what the results were and the benchmarks in the different categories related to your direct-to-consumer wine business. And I'm going to try a bit of an experiment. If you probably won't have your actual figures in front of you, but if you want to try and play along or take a couple of screenshots, you'll see that I'm going to show you how to calculate your own benchmarks as we go. All right, so this survey is in its second year, and we were pretty much asked by the wine sector to take this on, I think, with a surging interest in direct-to-consumer that's happened in the last few years. Wine Business Solutions were already doing a survey, so we actually collaborated with them this year to make sure that we didn't pester wineries with too many surveys. So this enabled us to rationalise the survey load and increase the response rate, and also allow us to benchmark our results against South Africa, New Zealand and the US, where he was also doing surveys. So there's over 2,000 wineries in Australia, and we sent an invitation to pretty much everyone we knew of. And this year, compared with last year, we made more active attempts to recruit the larger wineries who probably didn't really fit in the mix last year because DTC was a smaller part of what they did overall. But we tried to get them in this year. And we also made the questions a bit more specific than last year in relation to income, and asked about 2 years worth of income in different categories. And that's a really important thing if you want to accurately measure some of these benchmarks, and also if you want to measure growth. But it did make the survey a bit more difficult, and we did find that we got a reduced response rate this year. I'm really hopeful that we're going to build that response rate over time. Certainly the people who know about it, the people who've done it, have been very supportive, and I think there's a lot of benefit to be had for the 2,000 or so wineries who rely heavily on DTC. And although that might seem like a pretty small sample, it's still actually quite good for getting statistical results, certainly at an overall level. We just weren't really able to divide up into different regions. So if we get more responses in future, we'll be able to do benchmarks by region as well. And then I was pleased to see that our results showed a good alignment with last year, and also with other wine sector statistics. So we do know that it was a robust sample and that the results are meaningful. So this is just a little overview of our participants. And if you look there, you can see do I have a pointer at all? There, I can just use this. So these are the smallest two groups, and they made up 36% of the sample, and they all make sort of less than 5,000 cases between them, which is pretty small. But in Australia, that's 66% of all the wineries. So in fact, this group was underrepresented in our sample, even though it has a fairly big share. And then these largest groups here, which made up 25% of our sample, they're less than 10% by number of wineries in Australia, although if you look at them by volume, they account for over 80% of the volume. So it's a really unusual industry that we have, where we have a very large number of very small businesses and then a very small number of very big businesses. And yeah, so just keeping in mind going forward that depending on the size of your business, this sample is probably slightly biased towards larger wineries than the overall population of wineries in Australia. All right, so the first thing that we looked at was this growth in revenue, and this is total wine sales revenue from any source. And the smallest wine size categories were actually showing the strongest growth with, 9 to 10% growth. Whereas the large wineries, actually, the ones in our sample, didn't have positive revenue growth in the 12 months to the end of June 2019. Probably not going to speculate too much on that. Could be the small number in the sample. We know there's been strong export growth, but it is difficult to grow revenue in a static market overall. But certainly the growth in the small wineries, which again, as I said, make up such a large number of our wineries, is really positive for the sector. And then this is the key. This is why DTC is so important now. If you look at this slide, the first thing probably to look at is the pink bars over on the right. Overall, DTC only makes up 3% of the volume of all wine sales of Australian winemakers. So that's including exports and domestic sales. Only 3%, or about 40 million litres, is direct to consumer. But it's 17% of the value. And there's really two key messages in this slide. The first is that the smaller the business, the larger the reliance on direct to consumer. And that's very obvious in how those bars decline as the size of the winery gets bigger. And the second thing is that value always makes up a higher share than volume. And what that means is that effectively the price at which you're selling wine on the direct to consumer market is higher than it is in any other wine sales channel, which again just emphasizes the importance of this channel. So here, this is looking at average direct to consumer revenue only by winery size. And overall, it's somewhere around $1 million. With, as you would expect, the larger groups having larger revenue. But funnily enough, we found with the very large group that they had slightly less DTC revenue than the group beneath them, which does reflect their under-reliance on DTC, but may also reflect the fact that we only had a small number of respondents in that category. So you can't be sure it's a meaningful average across the whole population. But these numbers were pretty consistent with last year, except down the bottom, that 56,000 in the smallest category was quite a bit lower than the smallest category was last year. So there's a little bit of a difference in the sample there. And then when you look at this across the board and at the 17% of total value, what this tells us is that DTC is now around $1 billion in wine sales revenue. And that's a pretty nice number, $1 billion. Now, this is where I'm not sure that whether you can play along at this point, because you may not have these numbers in front of you. But if you're not very familiar with working out these sorts of statistics, you can perhaps take a screenshot of this and have a look at it later. What I'd really like to convey in this is how simple it is to calculate some really important benchmarks for yourself. And certainly, I guess I'd like to promote the survey, because if you do the survey each year, you'll have these numbers in front of you in your response. So here, if you calculate, or if you have a figure for your total wine sales revenue for this year and for last year, and it really doesn't matter when you're doing it yourself, if you choose to use a calendar year or a different 12-month period from the one we use July to June. And if you can divide up your sales into each of these different channels and put the figures in across all these boxes, your change in revenue is very simple. It's just this year divided by last year -1, and that will give you your growth or decline, hopefully not, in the past 12 months. And then what you can also do is if you want to calculate your share of direct to consumer compared with the benchmark averages for the survey, it's just the direct to consumer revenue divided by the total revenue. Hope that makes sense. So then the next thing I'd like to show you is, when you then look at average revenue per bottle, this is again where this is this at the heart of direct to consumer, is that the per bottle price is way higher than any other channel. And here, this is only packaged wine. So this isn't including bulk wine, which is obviously sold a lot cheaper again. But even just within packaged wine, direct to consumer is basically double the average value than any other channel. I accept that there are higher costs associated with selling direct to consumer than perhaps putting wine onto a ship or in the domestic wholesale market. But nonetheless, this highlights the very high value of the channel. And then again, if you want to work this out for yourself, if you've got the value figures from before and you have the volume figures, which also you can repeat the previous performance metric slide with volume instead of value, and then obviously divide value by volume, that will give you your average case value, and divide that by 12 and that will give you your average bottle value. You can see how that compares then with these benchmarks. All right, so at this point in the survey, we move into the direct to consumer in particular and tease out the different elements and the way in which those various channels are operating. So first of all, Cellar Door was 53% of all DTC revenue. Perhaps not surprising, but actually it had grown from 44% in 2018. So I think that reflects a genuine growth in the channel. And we also, this year, we asked about sales of wine through your own restaurant, and there was, 5% might not seem high, but it's pretty high as a percentage contribution, considering that not everyone has a restaurant, and compared with your whole wine club for the year, it's quite a small sector, so it's over indexing. And the other thing we found here was if you looked at growth again by the different DTC channels, most of them are growing at around that 9 to 10%, especially your Cellar Door own website. These are the big channels, so they contribute to that overall growth rate of 9%. Events, that showed a high growth, however, it was the lowest base. And I'm actually a bit puzzled about events because this year the contribution from events overall was quite a bit lower than last year. So I'm not really sure what's going on with events, whether they're actually growing or not growing. I think we need more data to see what's happening there. And again here, so that this is one you can do for yourself then. This is very much the same as number one, but this time instead of having your overall channels, export, domestic, wholesale, direct to consumer, you now tease out your direct to consumer by the different categories, if you like, put in the 2 years worth of figures, and again you can calculate change and share. And these are then things you can start formulating goals around. What did you want your wine club to grow by more? Were you surprised that your own website sales went backwards in 2019? You need these figures to know those sorts of factors and then put strategies in place. So there's obviously no point saying hands up, but at this point, ask yourself, do you know what your average case value by category is? So in these categories here, do you know what your average case value is? Well, if you do, please pat yourself on the back, and then let's see how you compared with the survey sample. So overall, the average DTC case value was $232 a case, which goes back to your $15.85 per bottle. And then you can see here that cellar door was the highest value overall compared with these other categories, except then for this own restaurant, which I suppose is not surprising, because then at this point you're charging effectively on-premise prices for your wine. And so there's, you know, this is your opportunity to capture the usual markup that the restaurant owner gets. And then the last little metric for this section, if you don't know how to calculate that, again, take the value and the volume that you have hopefully recorded from before, and that will give you the average case value and the average bottle value for each of your DTC categories.
So we have some questions and a comment. One of the comments says that we, in your stats there, do we need to add back in the wet tax because that can be claimed through BAS? Yep.
Okay, that's a complicated question. We ask people to leave wet out in the survey because, yeah, effectively we're trying to get revenue, not including the GST that you charge and not including the wet that you charge, because it's complicated, because then some people are going to get rebates and some are not. If you're doing this for yourself, it won't matter whether you put it in or out, but I think I probably need to sit and look at the maths to work it out, because the overall rebate is probably not going to apply across all your sales, so it might be difficult to compare if it's included. So it might be safest to leave it out, but I'm probably not close enough to it.
So on that question, it's just a clarification's come through saying that it was specifically related to the wholesale, as the D2C will include wet. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah. So again, yeah. It's tricky, isn't it? Because then if you look at exports, you're going to have some taxes on that. So it is hard to compare apples with apples. My suggestion, if you can, would be to leave wet out so that you can compare it with your domestic wholesale. But we know they're going to be different. We know that DTC needs to have higher revenue because there's higher costs associated with it. But if you can try and remove taxes, which really don't help you at all, they're an in and out, then that's probably a better way to do the calculations.
Question around events. On the events, were they on-site or off-site for Cellar Door?
That's a good question too. I've seen in the American, the Silicon Valley Bank report, that they actually divide events into on-site versus off-site. We did not specify. So, and again, it's always a trade-off between how much detail do you want to ask for, how much nuisance factor do you add in by asking people to separate the two, versus are you getting a meaningful result? So in this case, we just said, please put in the revenue for events. So I would say that what we have reported is a mix of on-site events, and anything. Could be fundraising, could be market stalls. Last year we asked more questions about, you know, what were the kind of things that you put into other, or describe the category, and there was a huge amount. There was party plan was one, so there is a big range. And again, I'd probably suggest for you, if you do on-site and off-site events, maybe if there is a significant difference, or one is a category that you're really working on, then I'd be trying to document the revenue separately and calculate the benchmark separately.
And one last question before we move on. There's a question around, did you survey the wineries and how they implemented their strategy? And if so, what was the best strategy for implementation, or are we preempting the future?
I think, the short answer is no, we didn't. It would actually be interesting to add a question to the survey that said something like, have you implemented an active strategy, you know, and how successful was it, or something like that, to try and see what people are doing. But our survey is not really going to go into that degree of depth. So I think that's where some of the consultants in the field who work with individual businesses, and also possibly the Wine Australia Growing Wine Tourism workshops, which, you know, take and give them a plug. You know, they're a series of webinars as well now, or online tutorials. I suppose it's a similar thing. They're available, and probably from them you'd get more qualitative information around strategies that people have implemented, because it might be a bit simplistic to just say, you know, did you implement something? Was it successful? Yes or no? You'd really, what we can really probably aim to do is have another year and show, let's say, stronger growth, higher average per bottle values, and start seeing that the overall sector is lifting in that way as we know more strategies are being implemented. We know we've had 2 years of the Direct Impact Conference, which I think has done a lot for giving people ideas for strategies they can build in. So yeah, I strongly recommend that everyone does do that. But in terms of evaluating strategies, I think you've got to go a step beyond what Wine Australia can do.
There is another good question that's come through. I think it's around telesales. So is telesales considered to be D2C in your data, or even though it's generally done by a third party?
Yes, that is a good question. Yeah, and last year we called it out, and it was a category in itself. We asked whether people did external telesales campaigns. In the revenue side, though, both this year and last year would have to come into other. And once again, I'm really interested to get these questions because, you know, as I say, we have to look at, do we add more categories in because people are really interested in having the results separately? Or do we not add them in because they add extra survey load? So we just have to kind of keep trying to get that balance, and the more feedback we get, the better. But in short, telesales conducted by an external company that you pay, I would classify personally as DTC, but I'm happy to be corrected on that and take feedback on that. Actually, this year, one thing we did do was separate out third-party online to make it clear that we didn't consider that to be DTC. So that appears in the first part as another category separate from DTC, because if you're putting your wine through a third-party online retailer, you're not selling it direct to consumer, even though apparently some of these online retailers think that they are your conduit to the consumer. So maybe there's a similarity between an external telesales campaign and a third-party online website that I'm going to have to think about.
Cool. Look, there's lots of questions. Shall we keep going, or shall I keep asking questions? What would you like to do?
I think maybe we'll go a little bit further, just to make sure we get through the stuff. But thank you. I'm so stoked. I don't think I've ever had a question before. All right. So let's look at some cellar door benchmarks here. Please keep the questions coming, though. We will address them. And if for any reason we run out of time or don't cover your question, please email me directly afterwards and I'll tell you how to do that at the end, or ring me up. I'm really pleased to have a conversation about this. All right, cellar door. So, you know, I think this would be not unexpected. 2/3 of cellar doors among the respondent group, which I think is typical, are open 7 days. And that actually is up a bit since last year. So further reinforcing that cellar door it's not just something tacked on the end where if you've got time, you might open up for tasting for anyone going past. It's a genuine business that people can reliably expect will be open when they want it to be. Interestingly, we have a very low level of by appointment compared with the US. But I think there's two types of by appointment. There's well, we're not really open, but if you ring up, we might be able to come down and open the door, which is probably more what Australian wineries still think of as that, versus what's happening more in the US, which is much more of a book ahead for a bespoke experience that will be just for you, which is a very different interpretation of what by appointment means. And that might be one that we start seeing come in more in Australia. Oh, okay. I forgot that I had little transitions on this one. So this is looking at the percentage of wineries charging for tastings. And this is, I think, a really important result that we saw in 2019. And so to sort of help you through the slide, what you're seeing there is only 2018. And we found that, you know, nearly 3/4 of wineries were not charging for tastings. But this year, For standard tastings, that's gone to 50-50. And in fact, now the slight majority are charging for tastings. And I must say, I questioned this. I thought, surely that's an anomaly with the survey group. But the sort of experts in the field that I spoke to said, no, that's very much the experience in the field, that wineries are moving towards charging for tasting, and it's a cultural change, which is really important. And then this year, we also asked whether people charged for premium tastings. And as you'd probably expect, 3/4 are charging for premium tastings. But I might just flip that around and say, that still means there's 1 in 5 wineries offering a premium tasting experience and not charging for it. And I'm going to perhaps put something together for you in a minute when I've shown you the next couple of slides. So this one, I think, it's probably not up to me to be disappointed, but I think perhaps slightly disappointingly, one thing that hadn't changed since last year was the standard tasting fees. So although more people are charging, everyone's stuck on the $5 or $10 for a standard tasting, and that those percentages were almost identical to last year. We did ask about premium tastings this year, and not surprisingly, there's a much bigger range and a much higher average. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But I find that result a little bit hard to interpret because there's so much range in, well, what is a premium tasting anyway? So I don't know how you benchmark that. But just good to see that there is a range and people are thinking about it. And then this one, on the good side, well, perhaps, so I shouldn't judge, the proportion that are not reimbursing had increased from last year from 15 to 30%, which I think reflects that, there's a change towards tasting being an experience in its own right. However, still the vast majority of wineries who even are charging a small amount and then are reimbursing that small amount on a minimum purchase. And that minimum purchase, the people who we asked to comment what the minimum purchase was, 67% said 1 bottle and another 13% said any purchase. So I would still maintain that this is it's a token tasting amount, and it's token also because it's so easy to get a reimbursement, and not a reimbursement that really does much for the winery. If you were reimbursed because you joined the wine club or put your email address on a database or something, I know that can be difficult to handle in terms of selling it to the person in front of you, but in terms of value to the winery, that would be a lot greater. Sorry, excuse the paper rustling, just looking at my notes. Right, so now all this, that tasting, this is all about the opportunity in front of you, which is about the people coming through your door. So who is coming through this, or not who, but how many people are coming through this cellar door? And we asked about overall visitor numbers, and the overall average was just over 17,000. Which was fairly similar, but showed some small growth from 2018, which I think is a robust number. Interestingly, though, I had some really interesting feedback on this. I had one rather well-known wine industry identity say to me, "Sandy, surely not. That's over 300 a week." And I said to him, "Does that seem a bit high?" And he said, yeah, that's very high. And I said, okay. And then I spoke to another person who said, well, we have 140 visitors a year. So I guess what that says to me is I'm not sure how useful that overall average is to you out there, because your number could be anything from 1,000 to maybe 300,000. But whatever it is, do you know what it is? And do you know what it's doing? Is it growing? And what are you doing with it? What are you doing with those, let's say, 300 people a week who come through your door? Are you selling them wine? Are you converting them to wine club memberships? Are you, those are probably the two main things. Are you giving them satisfaction? Are they spreading the word and promoting your brand from there onward? Now, just on these visitor numbers, this is another way to look at visitor numbers, and it's through the Tourism Research Australia. They also provide visitor number information. And this is just domestic visitors here. And they obviously have a lot more numbers that they survey, but I thought it would be interesting to compare their results with ours. So there's like 8 million people who visited a winery in 2019. And the growth is small, only 2%, but they spent $9 billion. And that's not just at a winery, by the way. That's what they spent when they were out visiting. But that's the opportunity. And then just for the sake of the exercise, and as I say, to test my results, I said, all right, take the TRA data and assume that every visitor visits 4 wineries in a region and that there are 100 wineries in each region, and then work out how many visitors that means for each winery. So, and then compare that with what we actually found. So if you remember from the previous slide, let's look at, say, Mornington Peninsula. We found an average of 23,000 visitors a year per winery, and modeling the TRA data in that way I've just described gives us a number of 24,000 per winery per year. So it's pretty similar. And most of those numbers I think are within the ballpark, although you could argue that the Hunter, our numbers were much higher, which probably means we had some of those large wineries in the mix who are getting more than their share, or it means that there are less than 100 wineries in the region. But I just think it's interesting for you to think about that. There's plenty of visitors out there. The question is, what are you doing with them? Now, do we want another break for questions, Linda?
Yes, we do, because they're coming through thick and fast. So
okay.
I will
keep an eye on the time.
How do I go up, Michael? Alrighty, so there's a lot of people agreeing with you about the D2C and third party should be, counted separately, and also, Michael's playing with the screen, and telesales. So that's all good. There is a question here. Did the data show how the impact of offering discounts via different channels, cellar door, online, wine clubs, telemarketers, etc., show an impact on the order volumes and the average order value overall?
No, we didn't ask about discounts. I'd actually like to, if the person is interested in perhaps sending me an email about that, I'd actually like to get my head around what we're talking about there, and whether that's something we can ask a question about, or whether it's a matter of we've really got to calculate this. Unless by discount you mean the reimbursement amount, that could be what is meant by that offering the reimbursement on the tasting fee as a discount on the price. If you didn't do that, do you get less in the way of sales? That would be a really good thing for you to test. So if you're concerned that not offering a reimbursement on the tasting fee will reduce your sales, you need these statistics. So you need to know, well, how many sales did you have before? What was your average value per sale? What is it after you implement that change? And what has the effect been? And I'll just put this one to you, because this sits in my head as this beautiful, it's not so much creative, but it's just such a clever strategy. Brokenwood presented at the conference in Orange in September. And what they do now is, instead of offering a reimbursement of the tasting fee on a bottle of wine, it goes as a credit against their restaurant. So you can spend that money in the restaurant, which means basically you're spending more money, you're spending more time, and you're having a broader experience. It gives them more contact points with you. And I just thought it seems so obvious now that they've said it, but I don't know of anyone else who's doing it. So yeah, there's other ways perhaps of getting that reimbursement.
Cool. There's 29% of people that are charging for tastings. The question is, does that include the ones that have some free tastings as well as some paid flights?
Okay, so it's now 52% are charging for a standard tasting. There is still a little bit of nuance. There must be people who had trouble with the question because they might have thought, well, I do for some but not for others. I would have said that perhaps I would have answered that question by saying, no, I don't charge for a standard tasting, but I do charge for premium tasting, which is a wine flight. And that's a subtlety. In the results, we did get some comments like, we charge if there's more than 2 people or something like that. So there's definitely a range that isn't captured by this survey. The survey is a bit simplistic in that way. But 52% of people, wineries, were now charging for a standard, what they interpreted as a standard tasting.
I think we talked about how many people are not redeeming tasting costs. What's the total number of people who are redeeming?
Well, 30% were not reimbursing. So 70% did offer a reimbursement.
And here's a great question. I love this one. What technological solutions are being implemented to grow sales for D2C channels? It's an increasingly digital world. What industry insights can you offer to help build that area?
All right. And again, you know, if it's not already obvious, I am not an expert in this area. So I'm an analyst with the market insights team, and my role in general is gathering and presenting data. So I've done the survey and presented the results, but I'm not an expert in DTC. I will come to a question about CRMs. I think digital solutions are around your integrated customer relationship management system and or your POS system, and sometimes they can do both. And I think that's probably where that solution needs to sit. If that person would like to email the question to us, I will give you a more fulsome and considered answer when I can talk to some colleagues and look at some research as well.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. We'll move on. Okay. So we'll look at wine clubs, and this will be shorter. There were fewer questions in this area, and for my money, slightly less satisfactory responses, if you like. For a start, not everyone has a wine club, so we're now down to a smaller sample size of people responding to these questions. But wine club revenue was 31% of DTC, so it's pretty significant, and it is growing. And in the US, they're now finding that tasting rooms or cellar doors are declining while wine clubs are growing. And I think that, you know, they've peaked as far as cellar doors are concerned, and they're now starting to need to deal with clubs. And in Australia, I think given where our populations are based and where our cellar doors are, we really need a way to keep people buying wine that doesn't rely on them turning up at the cellar door every time. So that's really important. So this is probably a good area to grow in the future. So this is just a quick summary of the results broken down by winery size. Again, I suspect that these numbers are good in the average, but there may be such big variation for individuals that you might not find this number all that helpful to you. But what is your number? Do you know what your number is? And do you know how much it grew or didn't grow last year? And importantly, do you know how many visitors you converted to club members? And I'll look at that with the performance metrics in a minute. So here, you know, these attrition rates and growth, the attrition rates are pretty good, and then, or they're not too high. And then we get a net growth rate, which overall sits at around 24%, which is a pretty good figure. I compared, so this is where, you know, you can compare yourself with the benchmark. I compared Australia with the US, and I think these numbers, you know, reflect pretty well on us. So the average club size slightly higher. Now the growth rate, this is the kind of raw growth rate, is higher in the US, but their attrition rate is higher too, because what's happening there is they've got staff who are incentivized, I hate that word, but there we are, to sign up new members. So they're getting paid to sign up new members. They're probably signing up a bit more aggressively, and then they're losing more of them. So their net growth rate is not as good as ours. But this is one I'd like you to think about. So on average, 572 new club sign-ups per year. Do you remember the number of visitors? 17,603. So anyone who's good at maths, that is a conversion rate of 3%, which, yeah, I don't know. Do you think that's good or bad? Is it higher or lower than yours? Do you know what yours is? I don't think it probably really matters. Everyone's situation is going to be different. The type of cellar door that you have, the type of visitors you have, your focus. But whatever your conversion rate is, if you can grow it, it can make a big difference. So for example, and this is in the full report, I calculated based on an average winery size that if you could increase the conversion rate from 3% to 5%, which is not a big increase, that's not terribly ambitious, 5%, that would result in a 20% increase in wine club revenue based on the average annual value of a wine club member. So this is where you put your figures in, your number of visitors. Now I didn't put this slide in, but I think, I can't remember now, the number of the different ways that people were counting visitors. Most people were trying to count visitors, but not perhaps as well as they could be. It's really important to count visitors. Just a simple door counter will probably do it. Do you know how many sales you make? That should be in your POS system. And if you know those two things and your value of cellar door sales, you can start calculating some really interesting stats. And then when it comes to wine club members, presumably you know how many members you had at the beginning of this year and how many new signups you had, how many members you lost. That will give you all those wine club performance measures. And then if you also know the number of shipments that you did, that's total, not per person, and your total number of club sales, you can get some really good metrics. So this is now, these are what Leslie Bergand, who is an American DTC researcher, and she talks about action metrics. These are the ones that you can measure. Then you can, you've set a baseline, you can then set a target, you can then put in place a strategy, and you can measure whether you achieved your strategy or not. And to her, the important thing was to convey that to your staff so they knew what they were aiming for. So all those things you can calculate just from those statistics from the previous page. And you will probably need a good POS system for that, and you will need a way of counting visitors. But other than that, nothing that you haven't already perhaps covered in the previous slides. All right, shall I keep going?
There is a quick question, and I'm not sure, sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but I'm not sure you'll be able to answer it.
Oh dear.
The question is, how can we implement a cross-border strategy with Chinese consumers so that they can still purchase when they go home?
Yeah. Yes, great question. It's certainly one that's being talked about a lot. Yeah, and I'd be interested in seeing what our growing wine tourism modules do about that. The big problem is postage, isn't it, to China? And there is work being done on that. Again, I invite you to email me that question because there are probably some contacts and references I can put in place and send to you. But yeah, it's not easy, but I think there are now some technological solutions again, and there are some things that Wine Australia are trying to support around, linking back to Chinese visitors at home. The other thing I'll bring up is at the end is wine tourism and how many of those visitors are international, and they're all coming from China, as we know. And so they're a really important part of your wine tourism strategy. But yeah, if they just go home and then can't find your wine, you have only a very limited opportunity to work with them. So yeah, it's a really important area that I will try and cover off perhaps by email.
Okay.
That's it?
You keep going.
All right. So just briefly here, now, looking at how you're communicating with your customers or your people who are interested in you, your followers. So the first question was, do you collect emails at the cellar door, yes or no? And I don't know about you, but if I had to guess before I did the survey, I would have guessed that the blue was yes. Do you collect email addresses at the cellar door? Probably from my personal experience at being in cellar doors, I don't know, but it never sort of seemed like a big deal. However, no, I was wrong. 82% of people, of respondents, said that they collect email addresses at the cellar door, which I was a bit surprised about. So I had a look at the comments around this. First of all, the no comments, they were interesting. No, only if they join up as a member or only if they subscribe to a mailing list. which actually suggests that they are sometimes collecting the email addresses. And then these last 3 comments really strongly suggested that people wanted to, and were planning to, or would like to, but hadn't worked out how to yet. So it seemed to me that actually the 82% might even be an underestimate. So then I looked at the yeses. Yes, if they join the mailing list. So those people are the glass half full people, aren't they? They're the same people who said only if they join up as a member, but those people said no and these people say yes. And a lot of other comments suggested that although they'd answered yes, they certainly weren't collecting 100% of email addresses. And I think overall what we're seeing here is it's an aspiration to collect email addresses, and also that people feel that they need to be able to do it better. And I hope we're not going to get a question about how do you do this better, Linda, because I don't know the answer, but I do know that there are consultants out there who work on that side of things. And so then, you know, briefly on this, it's a powerful thing once you've got someone's email address. And I think the wineries are valuing it and are dealing well with those email addresses. So, you know, 80% are using an email marketing service, you know, your MailChimp. So the thing about MailChimp, it's got a lot of power for managing that list and for the way that you communicate and for targeting your communications and segregating lists and all sorts of things that you may or may not be using, but you have the potential to use, probably to a greater extent than if you're using direct email. Here's some telesales. There's a bit of telesales happening here, but we didn't cover revenue. Social media, we tried to specify we weren't talking about the fact that you're promoting or sort of broadcast messaging on social media. This would be if you were direct messaging people. And there was still a higher proportion than I was probably expecting. And a bit of a decline in direct emails, which probably reflects the fact that people are moving towards better methods. And the frequency of communication, more than 3/4 of the respondents were communicating with their customers at least quarterly. And I mean, there is probably a bit of a mix in here. There's probably a mix of, well, there's my wine club members, and then there's the general database, and then there's the person who put their name on a list at an event last year. So, you know, I realize that people probably sometimes had to compromise in their answer, but nonetheless, this, you know, I think this is a good thing that people are actively communicating, choosing good methods. It's just a matter of getting those good email addresses on the list, isn't it? And finally, it was funny, when I went to the DTC conference in September, my role was to present these results sort of hot off the press. And the question that I was asked more than any other, sort of offline in lunch breaks, and that was, what's the best CRM system, and what was the main one people were using? And I'm afraid we don't really have a sort of really clear answer. That certainly these companies were represented at the conference, they're represented in other environments, they're trying to get your business. But at the moment, it seems like there's an awful lot of them, and they're all being used, you know, by a small proportion of people. There was really no clear winner except possibly Wine Direct coming out most strongly. The other comment that our collaborator, Wine Business Solutions, has made in his report, which I don't think he'll mind me saying, is, you know, it's not so much the system you use, but the way you use it. There's no point in having a, you know, all bells and whistles fancy system that will, you know, just about turn up at your customer's door with the right wine for them if you don't know how to set it up, or you haven't got the time, or you haven't got the mailing list to make the most of that. So, you know, it may be that having a simple system is what works best for you, and provided that you're using it in the way that makes the best value out of your individual followers and customers. So that's pretty much what I had. I've got another slide to talk about where you can get further information. The key takeaways I think are fairly obvious. It's a high value channel, and it's the one that's growing. I mean, domestic sales are flat. Exports are growing. They're good, but direct to consumer is growing strongly, and that's the highest value channel and the largest channel for small winemakers. Cellar Door's at the heart of it. There's more potential. I think there's more potential to look at conversion rates, to charge more for tastings, to change the offering make the offering more meaningful as a wine tourism experience, not just as a try before you buy. And as I say, I want to really plug the benchmarks. So I'll
before you you wrap up, there are some things that come through. So there's a number of people that have talked about the China concern. So I'm wondering actually whether that would be a great topic for Wine Australia to take on next year for another webinar, because there seems to be a great interest in that. So we'll take that up with the Wine Australia, and I'm sure Sandy will go back and talk to people there as well.
I will.
The second thing is there's a number of comments here and references around the 82% of people collecting data. People thinking that's a little high. One person actually wrote that they were a mystery shopper in 2017. They went to several premium outlets, bought 2 to 3 bottles each, and only 3 people out of all the people they visited actually asked for their contact details. So there's some question around that. So do you want to talk to that?
Yep. I absolutely agree. I mean, I think that was what I tried to convey in the way I presented those slides, that I was surprised at the number. And then when I looked at the comments, I thought, yes, even the people who have said yes, they're saying, oh, yes, we try to, or yes, when we can, or yeah, yes, staff are meant to, or yes, if they join a mailing list. So in fact, they're saying yes, but I agree that their behavior is not absolutely every visitor through the door, we get their email address. And I'd also probably just add there that another good colleagues made the case, and it's a very good point, that you probably don't want to just get everybody's email address, because all you're going to get then is a whole bunch of people who unsubscribe the first time you write to them. It's really more about how you collect that email address, how you make a meaningful sort of discussion point with them, how you perhaps have the time to spend 5 minutes, talk to them about what they like. And yeah, I'm getting well out of my realm of expertise here, but I agree with the comment. I don't think it is 82% of collecting all numbers, all email addresses. I think probably it's not something you should be aiming for, and I hope I haven't suggested that you should be. Having email addresses of people who want you to communicate with them is a really, really good thing. I think wineries are probably doing that well from the other slides about methods of communication, but getting the right email addresses is going to take a strategy, and that's a strategy you're going to have to put in place to get it right.
Look, there's a few other comments, but I'm going to save them till later. Right. So if you keep going, that'll be great.
All right. Well, the last thing I just wanted to talk about was if you want to go into a bit further detail. So the report on the survey is on our website. The international report through Wine Business Solutions can be purchased through them if you go on their website. So that has used the anonymous data from our results and done a bit more with it, because they are a consultant in the area. So they have made some commentary. So it's a different, I'm not plugging it, but we did collaborate with that business, and though the information is presented in a different way in that report, plus there's a bit of comparison across countries if you're interested in that. This month's Grape Grower and Winemaker has a whole feature on DTC. I just brought a copy with me. There's an article by me in there on the survey results again, which also sort of features those benchmark calculations. But there's a few other articles in there as well, because they covered the conference, so there's a bit in there. I encourage you to you can contact me, sandy.hathaway, or market.insights@wineaustralia.com. And I can, if you're interested, if you didn't do the survey, I can send you a copy of the survey questions and you can fill them in for your own benefit. And I strongly encourage you to fill it in next year. So, you know, you can start thinking about, well, what are the things I should be collecting here? If you did fill it in, or if you've got your results, I can also give you a template report that calculates your benchmarks. It calculates the things I was showing you in the earlier slides how to do. And I'm happy to do that for you. So you can contact me around that. And then just in terms of wine tourism, I just want to promote the fact that Kirsten, my colleague, has just published a wine tourism snapshot on our website. And it's also the subject of a market bulletin today. So if you're on the list to get market bulletins, you'll get an email about 3 o'clock today with our new wine tourism snapshot, you know, an article around that and a link to the snapshot itself. That just talk to you a little bit more about where the visitors are coming from and what they're doing and what else they're doing when they're not visiting wineries, and a bit of a regional breakdown. So if you're interested in that line, there's that. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say around that. So yeah, we've probably got time for a couple more questions, haven't we?
We have. So there is a question around the Wine Business Solutions report. What's the name of the Wine Business Solutions report? Do you know?
Taking the direct route.
Cool.
So I'm sorry, I don't have a link there, but if you put Wine Business Solutions into Google or whatever, or again, you can email me and I can send you a direct link.
Excellent. So there's been a few people asking whether the slides and everything are available. The presentation will be it has been recorded, and you'll be sent a link tomorrow. You'll also find this presentation on the Wine Communicators of Australia website, so you can access it at any time in our webinar section. I think that's it, Sandy. I have to say, you have had the most questions, I think, out of the entire year. Well done. Congratulations to you. Look, as I said before, I'm very excited to have Sandy here today, and what a great topic to finish the year off on. The webinar program is very comprehensive from Wine Australia, but also from Wine Communicators of Australia. We do a minimum of 12 webinars a year. So thank you for all of you who have attended most of those. We get some regulars, so really, really appreciate your attendance. Our webinar program will recommence in the 11th of February 2020. I love saying 2020. Keep an eye out on our website for details there, but we'll also send out an email to you. Once you've actually registered for a webinar, we do add you to our webinar database, and so you will get those emails. Please don't unsubscribe, because there's always great presentations like from Sandy. On behalf of WCA, I would really like to wish everybody listening to us today a happy and safe festive season and a really successful 2020 vintage. Until next year, see you then.